Hello, everyone, and thanks for being here with me today. I want to start by thanking ComIT for allowing me to be a part of this really special platform that allows people some opportunities for new learning during these challenging times of isolation. I'm Tara Noble. I am a social worker with a private practice in Toronto. And over my 20 years or so experience working with children and families, I have had the opportunity to explore and work with families on a variety of different challenges that they have faced. And one of them being grief. I have had a number of years working with families who are preparing for a loved one to die and also looking for support during their grief journey. It is a really privileged place to be when people invite you in and allow you to support them in the challenging times that they're having. But it is this experience that brings me here today to talk about grief and resilience. Because what I really want people to know is that grief is not something that is stagnant. It is a part of our story. It is a chapter in our book, and it's something that we hold lifelong. And if today those who are grieving gain some insights about their own grief, that would be great. And if those who have somebody in their life who is grieving could also gain some insights about how to compassionately support their friends and family, that would also be something that I would hope people could take away from today. The topic of resilience and grief comes from my experience working with children and families who are grieving, but it also comes from seeing the miraculous things that can happen when people are given the space to grieve, that they understand what's happening for them, and they get to move through their world and learn new ways of coping and ways of being in their new normal. I want to just highlight this quote because I think it exemplifies what I'm hoping to get across today. And that is that grief changes us. The pain sculpts us into someone who understands more deeply, hurts more often, appreciates more quickly, cries more easily, hopes more desperately, and loves more openly. I think in adversity, we can learn to have self compassion. We can learn about vulnerability that can help us grow and approach the world in a different way, in a new lens. So today, I want to start by talking about what is grief. And grief is really a holistic response to any loss. It's normal and it's unique to every individual. Grief is a lifelong journey. So one of the things that's not often helpful to a grieving person is when we can say to them, oh, I understand, or you should be doing. I think that when we take a step back and we consider what people are going through, we can do it through their lens and support them in a different way. It's important to note that grief affects all areas of our life. It affects our emotional well-being, our social well-being, our spiritual well-being. It affects our family relationships. It can affect work or school or other responsibilities that we have. It also can impact on our behavior, and we may notice behavioral changes. It is interesting to note that there's science behind grief, and that is that grief actually impacts our brain. It goes in and it's like an ice cream scoop, and the part of our brain that allows us to remember things, to problem solve things, and emotionally regulate. So it is really important that when we're thinking about grief, that we can have some understanding that some of the things maybe we used to be able to do or used to be able to focus on or could remember easily may be a little strained in our time of intense grief. So what does grief look like? I think we all know the grief that looks sad or crying, but it can also include anger. It can include restlessness, fatigue, sleepiness, drowsiness, nightmares, having increased worries and anxieties, especially about themselves or loved ones or other people in their world. Grief can have people withdraw socially. It can increase depression and anxiety. It can also impact our appetite. Some people in stress and in grief may find themselves eating more or with comfort food, and others may feel that they don't have an interest in eating. Like I was talking about, grief can really impact our focus, our ability to problem solve, and it can definitely impact our motivation. And sometimes this can last for longer than we would hope it would, but we can have compassion for it and we can understand that this is happening for a good reason. I think what I also want to be able to highlight is that in grief, we can still experience joy, hope, excitement, and happiness. It can sometimes be harder to find, but it is important for us to look for those things and appreciate them where we can find them. So, really, what I'm saying is grief can have a balance of all these things. And in any given moment, any given hour, or any given day, we can move throughout all of these different feelings. So, what do grieving people say? I think over my time working with different people and their experience of grief, I have heard a lot of themes. And one of them is a theme of isolation, that they really don't feel understood or that people are expecting them to move on or move forward. Um, People struggle to fit into social circles. I don't know how many times I've heard people say that when they walk into a room as a grieving person, people feel sorry for them and they can feel that and they experience the head tilt and then some avoidance of any conversation because they're uncomfortable. Often people talk about how in their own grief process, people around them aren't acknowledging their grief or not talking about their person who have died. And that can add to the sense of isolation. They also feel misunderstood or judged. I don't know how many times I've had the conversation with people about timelines and what people feel they should be doing. And it's kind of a catch-22 because some people are told maybe their grief ended too early, or other people are told maybe their grief is taking too long. And that's a really unhelpful place for people who are grieving because, like we were talking about, grief is a unique journey and will take whatever time it takes for people. People also tell me about not feeling normal. And that's kind of that place that we were talking about, is that they don't have the insight or understanding that grief is actually doing something physiological to your brain. And at a time of intense emotions, and when you need all those resources the most, we can access them the least. I wish I could tell you that, grief had this linear process that people used to talk about Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief. Um, as somebody who has her own grief story, there are no 5 stages. When you love somebody or you have a complicated relationship with somebody who's died, they stay with you forever. And that means that grief will ebb and flow over time. There will be times when it feels more intense, and there will be times where you feel that you have a mastery of life and your grief. So, why is grief so hard to talk about? I can tell you that as a grief counselor, there have been many dinner parties that I have walked into, and when people are introducing themselves and saying what they do, people look quite interested until I say I'm a social worker and I work with children and families and I do grief counseling. And you can almost feel the pause and the discomfort in the room as I say that. And what I really hope for in the world is that we can acknowledge that discomfort and somehow work through it, because we will all grieve and we all grieve at some point. And how great would it be if we knew we could talk, if we could share, and people would continue to support us? So, again, why is it so hard to talk about? Well, it's just uncomfortable to talk about death and dying. Often people say to me, well, I just don't want to say the wrong thing. Or they worry about if they talk about the person who has died, maybe they'll actually create more upset or more worry or more discomfort in for the grieving person. And the other thing that I've noticed is that people say, I just want them to be happy. Well, in order to find our happiness, we also need space. We need space to talk about the hard feelings, to talk about the challenge, and to feel supported and develop new skills as we grieve. The other thing I would say to people is, man, even as somebody who does this for a living, there's often times where I think I've said the wrong thing and I just try to catch myself. Or I might try to sit back and ask somebody, you know, what might be helpful, or I am sorry if I say the wrong thing. I just want to be here for you. We can create space for grieving people to talk and to share and to genuinely feel all of the things that they're feeling. So, what is resilience? Well, resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, or significant source of stress. It involves behavior, thoughts, and actions that can be learned and developed in everyone. So I ask you, how do we promote resiliency in grief? Well, we have to let people be their genuine selves and be on their genuine grief journey. We can't ask people to get over it or to not think about it. Because when I think about grief and triggers for grief and times when people need the most support, they often get it within the first year, but then that year wanes and people go back to doing what they're doing. And the grieving person is left with new milestones, new experiences that they're missing their person, new challenges that bring up old triggers. Maybe something even as simple as that day they walked through the bay and smelt the cologne of the person that they loved who's died. So, how do we help people? We let them be genuine. We let them have space. We let them have mistakes. We let them talk. We let them share. And in doing so, we let them find how they can manage their own adversity, how they can be vulnerable and strong all at the same time, how they can learn new ways of being, new ways of thinking, and new ways of navigating the world. So when I think about factors that contribute to resilience, we need to help people make realistic plans, but not ones that are rejecting plans. Like, you know, the word should. I wish I could erase the word should from any grieving process. But what might be a realistic plan for a grieving person? Is it the time to sell a house? Is it the time to make big life changes? Or is it the time to get up and put one foot in front of the other and accomplish what they can in a day without guilt or blame or shame for what they are unable to accomplish? We want to look for self discovery. What are the resources within us that we already have? And what are the resources that we need to build so that we can continue to grieve in a healthy way? We want to nurture positive views of ourselves in grief. And what I mean by that is really when we create that safe space to talk without judgment or shoulds from other people, we get to really sit in that we're not damaged in our grief. We are experiencing something really genuine and real and legit. We really need to keep things in perspective when we are looking at what creates resilience. Often we can find ourselves in hopelessness or believing that we should be accomplishing so much more than we have the capacity to do in any given moment. But if we keep things in perspective and we can look at where our supports are and we can look at what is doable, then we can actually feel a sense of autonomy and accomplishment. Resiliency is also about maintaining hope. And as a grieving person, the balance of a healthy grief is feeling our feelings, but also seeing hope for the future and seeing hope in finding the things that we love again and things that we can do again. Resiliency is about finding the capacity to manage strong feelings and impulses And grief is all about feelings. It's all about trying to find the ways to feel better. And sometimes that can lead to some impulsive behaviors or some impulsive decisions. And again, finding the resources to help manage those parts of grief are really, really important. I had a client once say to me, when we talked about blame and shame and what should grief be and what should she be doing, we had a conversation about what would grief look like if you could just do it in your way. And she said to me, I would get up every day and I would be curious. I would be curious about what feels hard. I would be curious about what feels good. I would be curious if I felt a sense of hope. And I would be curious as I'm developing the skills to keep going forward in this new way of living. So, why do I keep focusing on this idea of being kind to yourself and self compassion and empathy? Because I think in grief, it is one of the most important tools that we can have, not only for ourselves, but as somebody supporting grieving people. So, like I said, instead of being judgmental about yourself and your grief, or thinking that somebody should be at a different stage, what if we were just curious and we cared about how somebody was genuinely feeling? Because we can hold hard feelings alongside happiness and hope. Um, I think that we can notice in any given day all of those factors. We can notice missing somebody. We can notice milestones. We can celebrate milestones for the rest of our lives. There is no timeline to when we stop grieving. It just changes over time. And if we can honor that and have bonds to our people that we love forever, then we're not asked to forget. We're not asked to be disingenuous to our feelings. We get to just find the new way of being, put our puzzle together, have grief as a part of our story. So, again, I just want to reiterate that this idea of resiliency and grief really does stem from being compassionate, from finding ways to get up every day and do the day, to access support and help when you need it, to find the new tools or new strategies that you might need to find a way to grieve in a way that feels comfortable for you. But what I want to say to everybody who is grieving, I want you to remember that it is a lifelong journey and it will get better if you are at the beginning stages. The intensity has a tendency to ebb and flow over time, and you can access support and you can find the strategies that you would need for now and maybe again in the future. I think the other thing that I want to say is that in these challenging times of COVID and isolation, there are many people who are preparing for the death of a loved one and they can't be there with them right now. And I want to say, my heart goes out to you, and there are creative ways to be connected and stay connected. And I would encourage you to think about what those are for you. And for those of you who find yourself grieving in these really challenging times, I would welcome you to be extra kind and compassionate to yourself, as we're not able to access some of the things that are really important and helpful in the grief journey. But don't stop reaching out. Don't stop asking your friends for support. And friends, don't assume your friends are okay. Reach out and just be a listening ear. Doesn't matter if you say the wrong thing. We can always go back and replay that and be there for them. So I want to thank everybody for their time. I hope that in this conversation, you've taken a few nuggets that will help you in your own grief or that will help you as a friend. Thank you so much, everybody. Be safe and take care.